Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome in Pakhuis de Zwijger. We have a real audience. It's not that big, but they will be active, I'm sure about it. And we have many participants online for this meeting, and the theme is the dark side of science. We need to talk about it this afternoon. It is about detection of image manipulation and post-publication peer review, and also the connection between the two, because when you have detected image manipulation, you have to post it on PubPeer, and that's an outlet for post-publication peer review. We have two distinguished speakers this afternoon. We have Boris Barber, who is involved and was one of the founders, in fact, of PubPeer, which is a platform, as I said already, for post-publication peer review. And it is a case of disruptive innovation in a way. They are able to hijack websites of publishers and journals. And when you install their browser extension, it will pop up when they have a command on the article you are reading. Publishers and journals and also some editors don't like that at all, as you can imagine. And then we have the Elizabeth Bick, the detective, the image manipulation detective. She's Dutch, she's living in the US. She has, what is it, 110,000 followers on Twitter. She's tweeting constantly. She seems to sleep once in a while, but mainly she is on Twitter, is my experience. And there she shows what she does, but she will show it in the lecture as well, and we will debate it together. So now these two presentations will be preceded by a welcome message by Jeroen Geurts, who is the chair of, let's say, the Dutch Medical Research Council. He wasn't able to be here, so he made a nice small video clip for us. So he will give you the welcome message after I've told you that we will have Q&A after both presentations as well. In the room, please be as active as you can. You need to represent 250 people. That's the normal volume we have in this hall, so everyone can talk for about 10 persons. That's not a problem. And then we have the many participants online. Please post your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. It will be a little bit moderated, but you would help us enormously if you are brief and clear in your question. Don't start a whole story. I cannot read that when I'm standing here, so please be brief and clear as you can. And I will try to moderate the discussion with questions from the whole world and questions from this room after the two presentations of Boris and Elizabeth. And afterwards, we can offer you a drink, alcoholic or non-alcoholic, if you like, when you're here. That's the bonus. And at home, you have to cater for that yourself, I fear. We have not sent that around. We thought about it, but it was too complex. So now, without further ado, please the video by Jeroen Geurts, and after that, I will announce Boris Barber.
Hi everyone, I'm Jeroen Geurts, the chair of Zonneweg and a board member of NWO, but also a brain researcher at Amsterdam University Medical Centers. Unfortunately, I cannot attend this event today, and so I would like to welcome you with a video message. It's fantastic that you're all here because today's theme is research integrity, and we're exploring that within two lectures. Elizabeth Bick will tell us more about the dark side of science, and Boris Barber will consider post-publication peer review via the website PubPeer. I hope you'll be able to learn from each other this afternoon and exchange knowledge. And I also hope that this meeting will provide you with insights and inspiration to further discuss this subject with each other. As researchers, we are often under pressure. For example, there's the pressure to publish in journals with the highest possible impact factor, and preferably as many articles as possible in a short time. There's also the pressure of obtaining funding for your research, of course, and the competition, as you well know, is considerable. All of these aspects exert a negative influence on the quality of science. Also, sections of society have doubts about science and question whether science can still be trusted because of these perverted incentives. If we're to demonstrate the added value of science, then we must continue to critically reflect upon our own actions. And so I'm pleased that in recent years, a research on research network has been developed in the Netherlands, NRIN, and it plays an important role in this. The network ensures that we include this subject in the discussions that we have, not only in the Netherlands, but also with researchers abroad. Examples are the National Survey on Research Integrity, the NSRI, and the Dutch policy document Good Science as well. And with these efforts, we are jointly taking the first steps towards improvement. Another important development is our search for a new balance in recognizing and rewarding scientists, which is very close to my heart. This includes attention for greater diversity and individuals versus team performances. And one aspect of this is open science, through which scientists are encouraged to share research values and research results with society. Clearly, an awful lot is happening. Research funders have a major role to play in all of this. We can only change the system by working together. For example, we can generate more possibility for researching factors that facilitate good science. I've just given the example of open science, which includes fair data and citizen science, but another example is replication studies. Here, the funders have really tried to adapt the way that we think about doing science. It's important that as research funders, we continue to encourage responsible research practices, both now and in the future. You're here on account of your various roles and areas of expertise, and we all share the same goal. Together, we need to ensure that scientific integrity and responsible research continue to receive sufficient attention. We highly value that collaboration at Zonnebé, and we wish to play our part. I certainly hope this meeting can help to increase critical reflection and awareness within science, and I wish you a very pleasant meeting and lots of inspiration.
Well, thank you very much, Jeroen Geurts. And it's nice that we have on tape that you promised to help us. That's really great. We need more money for research on research integrity. And yes, you have done a good job already. And ladies and gentlemen, you may or may not know it. Jeroen used to be the chair of the Young Academy in the Netherlands, which is the young part of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. And he took the initiative to put research integrity on the agenda. And he organized a screenplay that's traveled along all Dutch universities. And we used that screenplay as well to open the 5th World Conference on Research Integrity when that was in Amsterdam. So it's near to his heart, and it's great to have him on the chair of the Medical Research Council of the Netherlands. It's really great. Thank you, Jeroen. He won't hear it, but I'll send him an email afterwards, or maybe a tweet. Because Jeroen learned me to Twitter as well. There was a funny story. When I was a rector of the Vrije Universiteit, Jeroen, as a new chair, came to visit me. And then after he left, the secretary went to my office and said, there is already a picture and a tweet on the visit he had in your office. I didn't even know that Twitter existed then. I'm on Twitter now as well, I must admit, but not as keen as Elizabeth and Jeroen, and not as quick even as well. Okay, let's move on to the first real lecture of this meeting with 2 real lectures. That is Boris Barber. Boris is living and working in Paris, and together with a few chaps from the UK, he will probably explain that as well, he started the PubPeer platform a number of years ago. I already told you that it is about post-publication peer review, that they hijack journals and publishers' websites, and they hijack even the website of the Netherlands Research Integrity. We don't like it that much, but it happens, and the algorithm detected us as something they had comments on, and the complaint is that we take sponsor money from Elsevier, if I understood this correctly. We have to talk about it later on. But anyway, that is what happens. And one of the main persons who put complaints and allegations and remarks on that website is Elizabeth Bick. And that's the reason we combined the two together in this afternoon's program. They just told me that they met at 12 o'clock today for the first time. They were only on Zoom together and on Twitter together, but they met for the first time here. So I'm so glad that I have the two of you here in the office because they form a very, very nice combination, I believe. And without further ado, Boris, I'd like to ask you to present your presentation, and we meet again for the discussion afterwards.
Okay, so a little bit disconcerting to not see most of the audience, but of course it's nice to have the true people, the people who are truly present here as well. So thank you first to Lex and Doreen for organizing this. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to come to Amsterdam whenever, but in real life especially. And before I go any further, just a brief disclaimer, I'm appearing on my free time, so my views do not necessarily reflect those of my academic hosts and employers. So there are a few real people here. I'd like to ask a few questions, if you could raise your hands. Who amongst you has a PhD? Okay, so a few people. Have you ever tried to correct somebody else's paper? Okay. Keep your hand up if it was easy. Okay. So scientific progress of all sorts. So here I'm speaking about, all scientific endeavor. We're not at all, for now, getting into questions of the dark side of science or hijacking websites. Just scientific progress requires discussion, analysis, confrontation of ideas, criticism as well. And there are a number of ways in which to do this. So there are the informal ways you discuss with your colleagues. These days you can blog about them, you can write a review. And science in general is supposed to be self-correcting as part of that progress. So when problems are, if any problems are identified, the typical, or let's say the traditional means of acting to correct those problems, to make progress, would be to write a new article, write a letter to the editor. Some journals have commenting systems. But if you've ever tried to make use of any of those methods, you'll realize that they're really quite restricted, dispersed, slow, ephemeral sometimes. And it's generally quite difficult to correct science. So why that might be, I'll come to in a second. But I quite like to slide in a paraphrased quote from Max Planck, who opined that science progresses one funeral at a time. So you kind of have to wait for the powerful people to die, for new ideas to supplant the old ones. What he actually said was much more complicated, but the idea is that in a nutshell. And as I was saying, there's actually, especially today, with the hyper-competition that we're all subject to, there's a very hostile environment for correcting science. And if you stop to analyze the situation a little bit, you realize that there are a lot of potential conflicts of interest, at least, at every level. Authors don't like to admit they're wrong. Journals don't like to damage their brand by admitting they're wrong, and institutions hate that too. So we're left with Upton Sinclair's very clear insight that it's very difficult to get a man or woman to understand something when his or her salary depends on them not understanding it. So why not bypass all those conflicts of interest using the revolutionary new technology of the internet? And simply share any useful information, researcher to researcher, bypassing the potentially conflicted intermediaries. And thus was PubPeer born in 2012. And the main founder is actually my colleague Brandon Stell. And he was helped initially by the Smith brothers. And I joined shortly afterwards, informally and then more formally. In particular, I formalized my role when PubPeer, which was initially run anonymously, became a formalized non-profit foundation, and that's the case today, and that happened in 2015. So it's really very simple. Every article that's published today, and most articles that were published in the past, have an identifier, a digital object identifier, and there are databases that allow us to recover sufficient information to dynamically create a page that represents that paper. So the title, the journal, the authors, and on that page, there's a text box. And if you have something to say, you can type your comment in the text box, press submit, and with a delay for moderation, it will be available as soon as it's enabled in any case, on this platform, a centralized platform, available worldwide. It's permanent, and it allows anonymity. So we're going to be discussing that in a little while. So what can you discuss? So anything scientific. So again, most people usually are motivated to discuss what they perceive is a problem or something that is unclear in the paper, which can go from perfectly technical details, questions of interpretation, up to and including more serious issues. And just a few examples. So a few years back, there was a lot of excitement about proteins that were supposed to be sensitive to magnetic fields and allow excitation of experimental preparations using magnetic fields, so deep within tissues. And there was some immediate discussion on the site suggesting that the results were not that solid, and there were also some problems of physical plausibility of the work. And users of the website, of course, would have been aware of that immediately, would have had an early warning. But it turns out 4 years later, a more formal replication was performed, and it doesn't work. There are any number of examples of the kinds of things that might be discussed. This is an example fairly close to my heart. It's in actually Nature Materials. They have results where less than one molecule has an effect, which is quite difficult, really, according to current knowledge anyway, but it doesn't seem to trouble anybody at the journal or amongst the authors. But also on PubPeer, enabled perhaps by the protection of anonymity, what appeared on the site was a lot of comments pointing to strange irregularities or regularities in images of scientific data. So in particular in biomedical science, there are a lot of techniques that make use of images, and the biological substrate has quite a lot of variability, and at least for some types of images, you expect a degree of randomness that makes every image more or less unique. And if you spend a bit of time looking at the image that I'm showing here, you'll notice that the bands that represent the separation of a macromolecule on a kind of chromatogram, you'll notice that the bands have quite distinct shapes. That's not unusual. They're very odd shapes often, and they're all the same. Okay, so maybe it was an accident, but none of the authors have ever shown up to explain how that accident happened. And maybe it wasn't an accident, and in a way that's quite amazing because this is in a publication. And take a moment of thought to consider what is the state of mind of somebody who's doing this in public and has the habit of doing that in public. So as the site kind of collected a concentration of this kind of comment, the stakes are quite high. In effect, when you see that, it's impossible not to consider the possibility that the authors have done something naughty. Okay, so they're unhappy about that, and they can't criticize their own work, so they criticize the anonymity of the site. The criticism that's made is that it's anonymous, anything goes. So that was never the case, and it's even less the case now. There's a whole series of guidelines, moderation rules that are applied, and we can go through them briefly. So first of all, comments are really quite restricted. They have to be scientific, they have to be factual, they have to be original, they have to be polite. Has to be relevant to the article. There has to be at least the appearance of, supporting an argument. Incredibly important, everything that's said has to be publicly verifiable. Hearsay is not allowed. So you can't just say, I know they cheat in the lab, I spoke to my friend, which makes it actually quite a bad site for whistleblowers from inside a lab. It's just not our job, unfortunately. Anything that implies misconduct has to convince the moderator. The moderator has to believe that there's a duplication of images, and they're quite experienced these days, the moderators. Authors have a permanent right of reply. They're alerted in most cases, and the reply appears with the same prominence in the same place. You can't see the comment without seeing the reply. So that's completely different to, if you're libeled in the Sun newspaper in the UK, 1 year later, on a court case later, you get a small apology on the back page. This is in the same place immediately. We encourage authors to reply. There are facilities for reporting abuse. There's community surveillance. There's a community of users. They do exercise those facilities. It's worth also remembering that we're discussing publications that authors chose to publish and warranted were worth publishing. And the final comment to sum all that up is, with all these guidelines, with the practice of moderation, with the experience of more than 100,000 comments in the database over nearly 10 years, the system works quite well in practice. In theory, it's certainly possible to abuse. In practice, that doesn't happen. It hasn't happened. And if you want to allege abuse of the system, please bring a few examples from those 100,000 comments. And I think it's worth making a little distinction with how much of social media works. So there's a good deal of formatting and restriction in what you can say, how you can say it. There's moderation. Everything is read except from trusted users. And there are no information bubbles, okay? So you don't have one gang on the right wing, on the left wing, if you like, on one side or the other, that barely see each other. Everything happens attached to the same thread, so that you can't form an information bubble. And if you don't believe me, I'd like you to meet some of our best salespeople. So if you go back just a year and a half, this tweet appeared. So Donald Trump cited a scientific paper. And when that came out, a lot of people realized there were problems with that scientific paper and the assertion made in this tweet. And sharing the correcting information was an emergency. Okay, an hour felt like a long time. Now imagine having to go through the usual channels. Okay, you write to the journal. So people did that, and the journal kind of published a correction 6 months later. Okay, so it turns out in this particular case, there's a suspicion that the editorial board was quite friendly with the authors. So I'm not going to go into the details. That does happen. Academia is a small world. Try writing to the university. So it turns out that the author of the paper was president of the university recently and still has good connections there. So the official channels really are not much use. And this was an emergency. But the same principle applies to all of your research. If there's a problem in a paper that you're basing your project on, you want to know about it as soon as possible, not when your PhD student has wasted their time. So there's a notion of an early warning for researchers that is really important and is pretty much absent from all other procedures. And we really see PubPeer's role as protecting readers and users of publications, sharing information about questions, not necessarily deep problems, but any questions that people might have, to alert maybe quite experienced users to potential problems. And in the face of the viscosity, at best, of the official channels, it can be really frustrating when you highlight a problem and nothing seems to happen. But please remember, any comment posted on PubPeer is publicly available and is helping any researcher who at least seeks to find out, independently of the inaction of the official channels. So here's another salesman, and he is doing his best to convince you that what you really need is anonymity if you're going to be making a serious criticism of a scientific paper. So this is, I've translated one of the threats he addressed actually to Elizabeth Bick and to me. And the anonymity protects you from career reprisals, from legal threats, and some forms of intimidation. So this person has 1 million followers of sometimes doubtful authenticity on Twitter, but some of them are quite active and unpleasant. Some overall statistics. There are now about 120,000 user comments in the database on about 40,000 papers, so there's more than one comment per paper on average. For about 5,000 journals, we have traffic of hundreds of thousands of views per month. It's about 50-50 comments from trusted users and comments from users who are not trusted or new anonymous users, and they are pre-moderated. You can see from the arrow on the kind of graph of historical comment traffic that when we enabled anonymity, then people felt free to make their comments. Although we do receive legal threats, we have been sued directly 0 times out of 120,000 user comments. And overall, our policy is for the content to be useful, and each of these comments was posted by somebody, a person, and they cared about that comment. And that's what makes the comments useful. The inputs to PubPeer, so users, some of the most experienced ones, so probably the most experienced one you'll have heard of anyway is Elizabeth Bick, who you'll be hearing from in a moment. There are some very regular anonymous or pseudonymous commenters. We mirror information from some curation services, Prelight, periodicals, the Science Media Centre in the UK. There's a bidirectional exchange of information with preprint servers, and we've started linking final publications to preprints that had comments. That's a service that nobody else can provide. If journals subscribe to a dashboard or institutions, they can make official communications about investigations they've undertaken, so editorial actions. Also, we draw editorial actions from databases when they're available. People are very welcome to link to blogs they've written if the content is suitable. And we have some amount of Twitter integration, so we embed threads and will alert users when threads are embedded. The outputs, so email alerts to authors, persistent personalized searches are available. So when Lex mentioned hijacking of websites, it's all a little less dramatic than that. We have browser plugins that detect DOIs that have comments, and a small flag is inserted in the web page. But it does look like the web page is giving you that information. So it happens on journal websites, author CVs. It doesn't happen on Google Scholar because they don't show the DOIs. But wherever there is a DOI, then that information is available. And the great advantage of that is that you can be alerted to discussion as you work and browse. You don't have to search for every paper. So there's also the Zotero Reference Manager has a plugin that performs the same function when you're managing your references, so that's really quite useful. I mentioned preprint, that's bidirectional Twitter. There are schemes available for journals, institutions, so they're dashboards, so they require a subscription, and that's how we pay our developer and administrative costs. And with a dashboard, a journal will be alerted whenever there's a comment about one of their papers, and an institution whenever a paper with their affiliation receives comments. So they can keep an eye on discussion about their papers and have early warning maybe of misconduct cases. So here's an example of what Lex calls hijacking, but if you visit PubMed or a journal site and there's an article with comments, you'll get a little flag inserted. It's no more unpleasant than that. So I've actually, how am I doing for time? 10 minutes. Okay, so in fact, I'm pretty much coming to the end of the talk here, so I can take a little moment over the conclusions, and I'm happy to answer as many questions as you have. So PubPeer aims to accelerate scientific progress. If you think about the official channels for commenting and trying to correct science, they were very slow, really very slow. If you have to publish a new paper, if they sometimes make you, do a new study to add the bit of discussion you wanted to put in about the previous paper, it's incredibly slow. So here, in the next minute, you can target a particular issue in a paper, very granular feedback, very detailed feedback, and it's available immediately. It's 100% focused on the content. There are no metrics, there's no reputation. Maybe we could do something, but in the end we decided we just want to focus on the substance, on the science, on the content. Okay? Maybe our principal aim in sharing that information is to protect users and readers of articles. Okay? The research is published to be built on, and if there's a potential issue, you can learn about it as soon as possible. PubPeer is not the Wild West. It never was, and it really is not now. So there's been a kind of Wikipediaization of the rules and the regulations. So it's all become a bit more complicated. If you think it's the Wild West, try and post a comment, okay, where you say something naughty. You'll find it's not that easy. And that's part of our policy, just to ensure that the comments are as useful as possible. Okay, so we really want the comments to be useful. We're not interested in volume, or more volume than we have. There's plenty of volume anyway. We're just interested in what comments are there, being useful, and having as many useful comments as possible. Now, in the best of cases, PubPeer really can gather the considered opinions of multiple world experts. So if there's something that's in the news that is really an issue, we're going to centralize a lot of worldwide expertise on that issue. So it's the place to come in that case. You should install the extensions both for your browser and for Zotero, which I can only recommend. That way you'll be alerted as you work without having to perform manual searches. We have all the guidelines to try and make the comments as useful as possible, but there's no guarantee. So please always bring your own expertise to bear when you see there's a comment on PubPeer. Read it, decide for yourself if it's useful. We don't have a higher aim than that. We make it easy to comment. We try and ensure that the comments are relevant and of high quality. But then it's up to the user to find them useful or not. Okay? The fact that there is a PubPeer comment doesn't necessarily mean anything. If you read it and find it useful, it might save your PhD's career. So please do install those plugins for that reason. And finally, if you've analyzed the paper, if you have something to share, some information to share, some insight, we try to make that as easy as possible. Help others by sharing your expertise. And finally, of course, thank you to all our commenters, because the site, if it's of any use to anybody, it is useful because of what people have posted on the site, because of the commentators, amongst others like Elizabeth Bick, who you'll be hearing from in a moment. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for this interesting lecture, Boris. I learned a few new things again, so thanks for that. We have a mic in the room, so if you want to say something, use the mic, maybe ask a question, and we have a few people online. But maybe there's a show of hands. First question, there you go.
Yeah, Willem Schoon at Trouw Daily Newspaper. I'm a science editor. 2 questions on your statistics, if I may. You mentioned the 40K papers being commented in the last 10 years. Could you say something about their spread over scientific fields?
Yes, so clearly the dominant subject matter is biomedical research, but there are growing communities in several other fields. So there's quite an active community in chemistry, for instance, and biomedical in a very broad sense, so as far as psychology. What there's less of, there are some technical, kind of harder science papers, technical papers, maths papers. So every scientific domain has its problems or things that need to be discussed. And it only takes a few dedicated users to make a difference. But clearly the dominant field is biomedical research.
Okay, and the second question is, you mentioned that in 10% of the cases, authors use their right to reply. I can imagine you want to go get that figure up to 100%, but what would be a realistic goal for that?
So, indeed, I didn't mention it, but it was on the slide, well spotted. So about 10% of comments, papers with comments, have a reply from the author. And that number has been going up over time. It is going up. So first of all, the comments that, the replies that are made are not always satisfactory. So there are, I mean, it's a kind of recognized pastime to spot the dog ate my homework kind of replies. If you spend some time looking at some of the comments, you realize there's really not much the authors could say. So, you know, the gel I showed, I mean, what are they going to say? Yes, it's a copy and paste job. So in some senses, you know, there are many cases where the absence of reply is probably an understandable policy from the author's point of view. So it depends a lot on, so in a small number of cases, there really are convincing replies. In most cases, there's not much to say or they don't want to reply. And there are also comments, there are maybe a minority of comments where, you know, it's a much more kind of discursive thread. And authors are happier then to intervene. What we do is we try and send alerts to the authors. So it's not systematic, not all emails work. We have to restrict to academic emails, which aren't always given either. So, but we try to alert the emails. The authors usually find out about the comments fairly quickly. They know that they can reply. So it's kind of out of our hands, really. I think if authors were less naughty, they might enjoy the discussions more.
Yeah. Okay, let's pick a question from the online audience now. Eric, no surname on this iPad, says, isn't it the case that when journals act upon an incident, repair an error, that's good for their reputation? So how can you explain that so many journals are not responsive? Do they really all not respond, or are there some good examples as well? So
I think there's always some pain involved in admitting an error. So in particular, the kind of high value journals, they kind of set themselves an impossible goal of, you know, really providing definitive perfection, and it's quite difficult to, you know, admit that I think most people find it difficult to admit they're wrong. I mean, maybe I would too, you know. So I think it's quite understandable from a kind of human or political point of view. So a few journals really are very proactive, but they're usually the highest quality journals already. An additional problem is it's extra work, it costs money, they haven't budgeted for it. There's also the reputational problems. So those are feed into the conflicts of interest.
Yeah. The better journals might have the money and the staff to respond as well. Yeah? That's fair enough. There was one question there. Yeah, please go ahead.
Bas van Steensel, Netherlands Cancer Institute. Very nice presentation, thank you.
Well, thank you.
So my question is about your plans to integrate PubPeer with the preprint servers. I find it intriguing. At the same time, I'm wondering how you're going to do this, because preprint servers have a commenting
absolutely. So we're just collaborating. So when there are comments on a preprint, we can, in our database, we can signal it as having comments. So if people are using our plugins, they can discover the preprint comments that way. We link back to the preprint server, and they return the courtesy. So when there are PubPeer comments, there's a little flag that indicates that. So that's the state of things. But what's interesting and where we can really add some value is what happens when the preprint is published. The journals generally aren't interested, generally don't link to discussion on PubPeer or preprint servers. So readers of the paper then won't know whether or won't have immediate access to that discussion. So a user of our plugins, we're now able to link the publication to the preprint. So users of the plugin will see that this paper as a preprint had comments and be able to find that information. So that's the main integration we see at the moment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's do another online question here, a very concrete one, bringing it back to the topic of today. Have you any feeling of what the proportion of comments is dealing with research misconduct? Is that 100%? Is that 10% or some other figure in between?
Interesting question. So there's I mean, you saw the images. When you see an image like that, I think probably it's misconduct. There's a certain class of problems where the authors should have known better. Maybe they did know better, but we don't really consider it misconduct. So statistical problems, I mean, sometimes, statistical analyses are extraordinarily naive, but somehow that's almost never classed as misconduct or reckless negligence or something like that. But there are also comments that are, genuinely open reviews of papers, quite neutral reviews. But I would say at least a majority, a sizable majority probably of the comments are, if you understand the comment, you think, well, there's a problem there, right? So,
an allegation of
so
misconduct.
I wish the authors wouldn't. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the photograph. If you were less shit, would be less activist. I mean, it's the kind of thing where, it is unpleasant, but that's what's in the paper, right? So
it's not a platform for professional debate.
Well, it is, but there's just so much of the other stuff that it kind of swamps or dominates the impression, right?
I can imagine. It became more or less a whistleblower platform as well, isn't it?
Because nobody else was doing it, really. Yes.
I can imagine. Yeah, but that was not.
So I mean, lots of people have things to say about papers that they don't, and it can be also nice things about paper. Please put that on the site. The authors don't mind nice comments at all, actually, but oddly enough. But
well, there's room for a campaign there, maybe. Sikko.
Hi, Sikko de Knecht. I'm with Utrecht University. When I was still a journalist before this, I installed the plugin, and I found all kinds of interesting things when I was browsing through, scientific sites, but also government sites and all kinds of other places like Medium. And now as a policymaker, I also greatly enjoy still having that plugin, so I would recommend everyone to just put it on your computer.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I guess the point I want to make is you don't have to, you don't have to believe anything you read on PubPeer.
No.
in real life, I think usually the comments are useful, and it might just save your bacon. That's the point, really. I mean, so absolutely follow that advice. Thank you very much, and install the plugins.
So my question
won't
really,
cost anything.
That's true.
I was wondering what the uptake of the plugin is, how many downloads you have, and what kind of people are using it, and maybe elaborate on the second and third order effect that the plugin can have.
So I'm not sure of the statistics. So I think for probably it's the main one, the Chrome plugin, there's between 12 and 15,000 installations. So it's, you know, it's of the order of few tens of thousands of installations probably altogether. So there's always room for more. We have no further information. We don't collect any information. We have no further information at all about who would be using it or how they would be using it, really. We could probably see what traffic comes into the site from the plugin, but it's not the majority of traffic by any means. So I really can't say much more than that. It's available to the world. Please install it.
Yeah. Well, here's another online question that could have been asked by Sigurd de Knecht, because he's focusing on open science currently. And that is, do you see many comments on open science stuff, like data sets? You mentioned preprints already a little bit. You can comment on that. Registered reports in its early stage, pre-registration and that type of stuff. They don't always get a DOI, I know that, but can you comment on that as well if you want?
So preprints in general attract quite a lot of commentary, so most of that will go on BioArchive and medRxiv have comments, but Archive don't, the historical one, but there's not so much discussion there's not so much need for discussion, it seems, on Papier for physics. So I'm not sure I've seen comments on a registered report. So obviously their volume must be very low. I mean, and it's just the beginning of
the number is still low as well.
The comments. So we do get preprint comments on preprints directly on Papier. So sometimes people are used to it, or they think it had more exposure, or maybe they have an anonymity worry or something like that. But there's occasionally, so Zenodo, for instance, has a DOI for their various products, so including data sets. Occasionally there are comments on those. So it's all possible. If there's a DOI, so books, often scientific books often have DOIs these days. So if there's a DOI, it's available, and an archive ID as well. But I think the kind of outputs you mentioned are just very low volume. Yeah. So in the mass of comments, it's kind of proportional to the publications, and we just see few examples, I'd say. Yeah,
that's fair enough. Iris, PhD student in research integrity as well.
Hi, thank you. Very nice talk. I had a few questions, but a few of them have already been asked, so I think we are all in this room with the same interests. I was wondering, do you have any idea how many of the Papier comments lead to retractions or corrections of papers?
It's something that we could do and may do. I mean, the obvious thing is just to cross that information with the Retraction Watch database. And at least one would have an approximation. Were there comments before a retraction? So the overall impression, which has got a bit better, but the overall impression is that there are thousands and thousands of comments, serious comments about papers on Papier, and on average, nobody does anything. Okay, that's the overall impression, and that's why Papier is, and probably will remain necessary for quite a while, is you have no other way of finding out about those problems as a researcher, as a user of the research. So investigations, research justice, if you like, is very random. Very, very random. There's no regularity. You know, occasionally something will blow up, something will happen. They might, you know, shoot the postdoc, but there's no no guarantee of anything happening. Even if there is a journal correction, sometimes it's not totally convincing either, often actually. So 10–15% maybe. So of course Elizabeth has actually great statistics on this, so she has a much clearer sample as well. So you can ask Elizabeth that question again.
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting thing. You have something to say about it, I'm sure. Let me plug in a question of my own. I'm still a little bit puzzled that when you enabled the anonymous mode, Papier grew so enormously. Is that still the case, that only few comments are named, or is that balance different now?
Still, the great majority of comments are anonymous in one way or another. So regular users can keep a pseudonym, and the advantage for them is, with some loss of security maybe, that they have a persistent character, and they can become trusted by the moderators. And once they're trusted, then their comments appear immediately and will be moderated if there's a report or a problem or something is noticed. So it's about 50-50 completely anonymous new throwaway accounts that are all pre-moderated, those comments, and about 40% of regular users, and then a small number of users who sign their comments, of which by far the largest volume is supplied by Elizabeth.
There's the ladies in the room.
Yes. Yeah. So she's probably the only experienced user who signs their comments. So for a while, the moderation guidelines changed and that stopped.
Yeah. Pretty interesting. There is another question online asking, is there any cooperation with Scope? And maybe we can expand that. Are journals following it proactively, what's happening on Papier?
Well, so I said that the overall impression is that not much happens. So that's not to say that people don't mean well, but the end result is not very convincing. And so what's very frustrating, and a point of kind of continuing discussion, Elizabeth, I'm sure, will mention that or could mention that, is when you see that, you know, the authors have cheated, we feel that, you know, the results really shouldn't be considered reliable, but somehow journals are perfectly happy as long as there's a picture where, you know, that lack of trust is no longer necessary. And so there's a big question, you know, if a manipulation or some sort of misconduct is apparent, what then should you do with the paper? So there are people that, you know, string them up, say it should just be retracted, and I have some sympathy with that point of view, but that's not what happens generally. And it is actually a COPE. So the COPE guidelines are quite messy. So the headline retraction guideline is just say that the main conclusion has to be unreliable. And it doesn't matter if you no longer trust the authors, or at least I know journals convince themselves that they can always trust the authors, even if they're so. It doesn't really happen.
So that's not a very strict criterion. Eh? That's your point.
Then they're just not very clear, actually, to be honest.
I can imagine. Well, Boris, I'd like to thank you again for the presentation and the Q&A. Thank you for being here. And let's move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the questions.
Yeah, it was great. Elizabeth Bick, I mentioned it already before. She's quite famous, not only on Twitter, but also the media outlets have found her. There was a beautiful piece in the New Yorker not long ago, really a long read, quite fascinating. Look it up if you want the details. And she has been featured in Nature several times as well. She is a forensic image detective. At least that's the way I frame her now, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But she sees things in pictures. And on Twitter, she's trying to teach that to the rest of the world. And I see a lot of your tweets. And then the question is, what is wrong? And sometimes I get it, but mostly not. and then the answer will be there, and with the colored caders along the stuff, and then I see it immediately. But I'm so puzzled, how are you able to do that? And you do an important task, I believe. This is falsification and sometimes fabrication of data. These are data in the pictures. It's also a bit of plagiarism, of course. Also self-plagiarism, taking parts of pictures from others or from yourself and recycle them without citing them properly. But basically, it's well, falsifying data sets. And it's serious business, not being taken that serious by the people that should take it serious. So it's a great pleasure to be able to have you on this floor and to explain what the trick of your interesting kitchen is. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lex. And yeah, thank you, Lex and Doreen, for inviting me here today, for organizing this. I think this is an extremely important topic, obviously. And I'm so proud to be here in the Netherlands, which I feel is one of the countries that takes research integrity very seriously and is trying to do something about it. As I have moved across the ocean, I've had some experience with lots of countries, and I feel the Netherlands is one of the leaders in this aspect to make this a topic that is discussable and that is just an important part of science, as it should be. So I have this sort of dual personality. I started my career as a microbiologist, and I am now a science integrity consultant, so I'm not longer employed, I'm self-employed. I run 2 blogs. Microbiome Digest is the one that I sort of started my online career with, and hence my Twitter handled Microbiome Digest without the E. But currently I'm more involved in science integrity. I just cannot change my Twitter handle anymore because I would lose all my followers, and I think that would be, I would really miss them. So I'll talk here today about a lot of things that could lead me into trouble. And if you follow me on Twitter, you know I'll be regularly attacked for all the types of problems that I've raised. And so I would like to start with my disclosure summary, because I'm asked the question a lot, like, who is paying you? And I am a consultant, so I am paid by universities, by publishers, sometimes by lawyers, to give talks about this topic or to look at particular cases. I also have 4 patents. This is from the time that I worked at a startup called Ubiome. And that company is now, the founders are being charged with fraud. So I don't think these 4 patents are ever going to generate any income for me. I also have a Patreon account, which is a site where people can donate $1 or $5 a month. And this is not, I'm not saying this because I want money, but this is a source of income for me. And these are just people who want to support my work and don't have any strings attached. I'm not being paid by particular people to investigate the cases that you will see me talk about online. All the consulting work I do is not public. I cannot disclose my clients. But all the work I do on Papier or on Twitter, that is the work that I do unpaid. And that is basically because of my Patreon account, I can afford to do all of that work. And so I also want to acknowledge a lot of people who do very similar work as I do. So I'm maybe the person who does a lot of this under my own name. And as you can imagine, the work that I do is not always, doesn't make me a lot of friends. So as Boris already alluded to, a lot of people do this work under a pseudonym. And some of these people are also on Twitter. And we do have a network of people who, where we discuss particular papers or where we ask opinions about particular figures. And I want to thank all of these people. A lot of them are listed here, or the people who provide the platforms that we can use, like Papier. So I do want to acknowledge that some of the work I'll be discussing today has not been done by me, but has been done by some of these other people who mainly want to work anonymously. So why do all of us care about science integrity? Because science is built on publications. Every science publication builds upon the work of previous scientists. So we publish our work, we cite other people's work, we hope that our papers will be cited by others. All of us researchers base our research on the work of others. So I see science as a brick wall in which every brick rests upon a layer of bricks below that. And if one of those bricks, one of those papers contains an error or contains fraud, that means that all the other papers built upon that paper are not on stable ground. And so when a paper contains a problem or a suspicion of fraud, we need to discuss that, and we need to make that a discussion, and we need to give feedback and warn others about that. That is why we are so, why we feel that this work is so important. So most scientists are honest and hardworking, and we might all make errors. I don't want you to leave my talk thinking that all scientists are fraudulent. That's not the case. But as a field, science is not immune to fraud either. So science misconduct could be all kinds of things. So in the United States, we have the Office of Research Integrity that defines science misconduct as one of three things: plagiarism, so copying somebody else's ideas or quotes without giving credit. There's falsification, where people might have obtained results, but tweak them, maybe leave out an outlier, maybe increase a value a little bit or decrease it, basically changing some of the results to make them better fit your hypothesis. And then fabrication is where a person might make up results completely, doesn't do an experiment, just sits behind their computer, types in some numbers and creates a beautiful graph without actually having obtained any measurement in the lab. So I also want to point out that behind every case of misconduct, I think there's a sad story. There's a story of people who felt that the only way to get further in their career is by cheating. People who feel an enormous amount of pressure to publish. People who might work in a lab where there's a bully as a professor who threatens to fire them. Or people who have obtained beautiful results as a postdoc, had high expectations, then became a professor, but their research now is not really going as well as it used to do. And they feel they need to live up to all the promises. And they feel they can only get that by cheating. So when I talk about misconduct, I sometimes have to name and shame people a little bit. But I do want to make it about the figures or the data. I don't want to make it about the people. I don't want to criticize people too much. I don't want to look up where they live or how they look like or comment on that. I think we should focus on the science and the problems that have arisen with those papers. So those are some important things. And when we think about scientific papers and the problems that we can discuss maybe on papier in these papers, there's just an enormous range of all kinds of problems. There could be things like plagiarism or errors or control groups that are not okay. So I focus, and I'm most famous for finding duplications in figures in scientific papers. But I've also worked on all kinds of other problems that you might find in these papers. And not all of these are science misconduct. In fact, there's a huge sort of gray area where a person can either do a very perfect paper without any criticism, or they can do flat-out misconduct. But there's actually a huge gray zone in between, where you can think of all kinds of research malpractices, maybe picking the wrong statistical error, but not doing that really maliciously. But yeah, there can all be all kinds of other problems. And all of these problems should be discussable, and not all of these problems are misconduct. So I specialize in research images. And when you think about scientific papers, most papers actually don't have any photos. Most papers will just have line graphs or tables or sequence data. But when papers do photos, and especially biomedical papers, photos might look like the ones you see behind me. There might be photos of tissues or cells or blots or bands or gels, things like that. And when you look at these images, each of these photos is unique. Like almost everything in nature, if you compare a bunch of leaves or a bunch of faces or a bunch of rocks to each other, we can tell them apart. We can look at them and recognize faces. I'm actually very bad in faces, so I would not recognize any of you tomorrow. But I can recognize photos. And most humans have this ability to look at these photos and recognize that even though these bands are all similar to each other, we can tell them apart. Each band, for example, in the top right, if you look at these, this is a Western blot, you can see all these bands that all have slightly different shapes and gray values and thickness and slants, but they're all different. We can tell them apart. So each of these photos are fine. There's nothing wrong with them. I have looked at them for many times. I have not found any duplications here. But there could be all kinds of problems in scientific papers. And I like to show this sort of simplified example. So these are not images you would typically find in a scientific paper. These are images of sunsets in Hawaii or somewhere else, somewhere nice. And you can see this is just to illustrate the certain types of problems you could see with papers that have figures. So I don't recognize a good Photoshop. I would totally be convinced that it's a real photo. But I can look at images and see duplications. And I think about half of the people in a typical company can actually see that. So if you look at the category 1 type of duplication that you see on the left, you'll see a bunch of photos, and you'll see that 2 of these images are identical to each other. And I put a green box around them. So this is a very easy to spot duplication. It's the same photo, the exact same photo is used twice. And in a research paper, it will be used twice to represent the same, to represent 2 different experiments. And that's not okay. This is an inappropriate image duplication. And I call this category 1, a simple one. In the middle part of the slide, you can see a category 2 duplication. Here you can see 2 images that have an overlap with each other. You can see part of the image is the same, but the image has been shifted. So this is a duplication with a repositioning. I call this a category 2 duplication. It could also be mirroring, zooming in or zooming out, or rotation, things like that. If you then look at the example on the right, which I call a category 3 duplication, this is actually my very bad attempt at photoshopping. You can see that one of the images has the same palm tree twice. And that's a duplication within a photo. Now, if you can sort of consider these 3 categories, I think it's fair to say that category 1 is most likely to be an honest error, while category 3 is very unlikely to be an honest error. And category 2 is somewhere in the middle. And this categorization helps me to decide what would be the best way to correct or to retract a paper, how to act upon this problem. So I've looked at many scientific papers and categorized them into these 3 images. And none of them was of palm trees, unfortunately, but they would look like this. So here's an example from a scientific paper in which I've shown you a simple duplication. You might look at this for a long time and maybe you will spot it immediately or not. But there's a couple of panels here that are identical, even though they represent different experiments. And I don't see these things immediately. I have to look at it for a while, and then I might see a duplication there. And I've marked it on the next slide. So there's 2 panels here that, if you look at the labels, they're different, but it's more or less the same photo. It's the exact same photo used twice to represent different experiments. So this is a simple duplication. And this could be an honest error. Somebody just had a bunch of these Western blots, didn't label them correctly, which is not good research practices, but it's also not maybe done with the intention to mislead. Although it might be, I mean, I don't know. But this is a category 1 error. So I've reported this to the journal, and I've reported this in October 2015 to PLOS ONE. And PLOS ONE has not addressed this. Well, this is maybe not really a very big error. I don't, you might not really care about this too much. But still, this is a paper cited by 106 people. And there's an error here, which is pretty obvious, but it hasn't been addressed. Here's an example of a type 2 duplication. So here's an example where you see 4 different photos, 4 different experiments, each of these represent a different amount of radiation. So cells were treated with different amount of radiations. There's 4 different irradiation versions. So each of these 4 photos should be an independent experiment. But if you look at this for a while, you might see that some of these photos overlap. And we would expect, based on the labels, that there were 4 different photos. But 2 of these, the top 2 ones overlap with each other, marked by a green box. And the right 2 ones also overlap with each other, marked by a dark blue box. So instead of looking at 4 photos, we're only looking at 2. There's some overlaps here. It's not just a simple overlap either. So it is a duplication with repositioning, a type 2 duplication. But there's also some change in aspect height. The height width is different. And there's a zoom in and zoom out. So I think this is less likely to have been an honest error. And something went wrong with the text here, but this paper got corrected. This was also in PLOS One. I think this should have been, personally, I would have liked this to have been retracted. I think if an author has 4 experiments and labels things so, so sloppily, then that you don't know which photo belonged to what experiment anymore, I would not trust any other results from that lab either. And there were actually 2 of these figures in the paper. But this resulted at least in a correction. The authors were allowed to send in a new set of photos, and the journal accepted that. Here's another example of a type 2 duplication, where you can see a repositioning. And maybe you already spotted it, the one on the top left is quite easy to recognize. So here are 2 panels, 2 Western blot panels that represent different proteins. They're called BACs and BAD, and it's bad indeed because one of the photos appears to have been mirrored, flipped. And but it's the same photo if you look at it carefully. And there's another set of panels, the 2 GAP-DH panels, also seem to be the same. Might be a little bit harder to see, but they're stretched differently in the vertical axis. These are the same photos as well. So there's 2 duplications here of the type 2. And this paper, I cannot read my... there's something wrong with the font, so I cannot really read it. But I think this wasn't addressed yet. This paper I did report to the journal, and nothing happened. Here's an example from a famous lab in France that is not very happy with the things I found. Here's a type 3 duplication. Here's one photo of what we call a Saturn Blot, so it's a blot of DNA, not protein. And at first glance, this photo looks fine. There's lots of different things to be seen here, and all the bands seem at different heights, and they all slightly look differently. But if you look at it with maybe specifically looking for duplications, you might have spotted that several of these parts in this image look very similar to each other, as I call unexpectedly similar. And I've marked them here with colored boxes, and you can actually see 4 different duplications here. I cannot think of any technical explanation that could account for this, but I've posted this on Papier, and unfortunately nothing has happened yet. This is also a pretty popular paper. It's cited by 116 other papers, and the author has not responded to this comment that I posted on Papier. Here's another example of a type 3 duplication. So again, a duplication within the same photo. Well, actually, this is not a photo. This is a graph. It's a line graph, I guess. But the human eye can still look at all these dots, and you can see that perhaps you can have spotted that there's repetitive patterns that are very unexpected here. So again, a type 3 duplication. This is a flow cytometry plot. I call these flaw cytometry plots because there's something really bad going on here. Maybe you've spotted it already. There's lots of duplications here. There's duplicated parts within the same panel and across different panels. I don't think this is real at all. Maybe the middle one was real, but the other ones were sort of generated out of Frankenstein parts of the other blots or so. But yeah, this is a plot that appears to have been manipulated. So I've reported this on Papier. I haven't reported this to the journal yet, but because that takes a lot of time. And yeah, nothing has happened yet. But I would not trust anything from this lab. So I've shown you some examples. A couple of years ago, I did this sort of as my hobby. I was still fully employed, and at night and in the weekends, just for fun, because I enjoyed doing this, I looked for images for duplications in biomedical papers. And I turned this into sort of a big hobby, and I actually scanned 20,000 papers by eye, spanning 20 different years, spanning 40 different journals from 14 different publishers. And if you think that should have taken years to do, well, it sort of took me a couple of years to do, because I still had a full-time job. But I only looked for the images. I don't read these papers, I just scan for them, and I can do 1 a minute if it only has a couple of images. Some papers, some journals have very complex images, complex figure panels, and they might take up to 15 minutes. But I can do, simple papers I can do pretty fast. So in that set of 20,000, I found 800 papers to contain duplicated images, like the ones I've shown you in the previous slides. That's 4%. So there were these 3 types, the simple, the repositioned, and the altered, these 3 categories that I talked about. So that sort of helped me to make to answer the question, how many of these papers are manipulated? What is the percentage of misconduct in the papers that I've scanned? So just looking at these photos or these flow cytometry images, about half of them I would estimate to have been altered with the intention to mislead the reader. And it's hard to say it for the individual paper, but because we had these 3 categories, that's our best educated guess, that about half these papers have been, the photos in these papers have been duplicated with the intention to mislead the reader. So does that mean that 2% of all papers contains misconduct? I think it's actually much higher. I think it's around 5 to 10%. And that actually matches the recent survey that has been done, in which, very dependent on the field, I think it was about between 7 and 10% of people who admitted that they might have done misconduct in their papers. And why is it much higher than the 2% that I found? That is, I'm just looking at photos. And it's typically easy to see these duplications if you can see them, or at least once you point them out. But how hard would it be for me to detect if a table was manipulated? I would not be able to detect that. Or a line graph. Anybody can draw a very convincing line graph. I would not be able to spot that that was completely made up, as long as you do it well. I can really only catch the tip, the very tip of the iceberg. The people who are dumb enough to leave traces. The equivalent of the burglar who leaves their driver license next to the stolen television. Like really, these are, for me, fairly easy to catch. I'm actually worried that the real amount of, the real percentage of misconduct is much higher than 2% and might be in the between 5 and 10%. And maybe even higher, because probably not everybody is going to admit that they did that even in a survey. And I also had a chance, because we had this nice data set, to have to sort of look at a relationship between the impact factor of a journal and the percentage of problems that we found in these papers. So I looked at 40 different journals, and this is the graph in which I tried to correlate the impact factor, which is on the x-axis, and the percentage of problematic images of papers, which is on the y-axis. And you can sort of see that there's an inverse relationship between them. If in the bottom right, you see journals with very high impact factor. That was Nature and Science. And I did find image duplications in those papers as well, including type 3 categories. So those, in general, they had a low percentage of these problems, but they still had some problems. Some journals with very low impact factor, I'm looking at Spandidos in particular, they have these journals have very high percentage of problems. But there's also some journals with low impact factors that do really, really well, that have very low percentage of problems. So it's probably dependent on the editorial team, the staff that works at these journals, or maybe the volunteers who run these journals, that determine not only how well these papers are screened, but probably also what type of audience they attract. Maybe the people publishing in Science and Nature are very well experienced researchers who know how to do research misconduct really well. This could be an interesting hypothesis. And maybe that's why we see a low percentage. And of course, there's more professional people looking at a paper that is published in Nature or Science than a paper that is published in a low-impact journal in general, generalizing here. But there seems to be an inverse relationship, and I think these are important things to discuss and to know. But yeah, it's not a 100% correlation. I also know a little bit about how journals respond, and we already sort of discussed this previously. How well or how poorly do journals respond? So that set of 800 papers that I reported all of these to the journals, and by now this is about 5 or 6 years ago. If you focus on the left bar in this graph, those are all 782 papers that I reported 6 years ago. And unfortunately, after waiting for 6 years, which is a generous time to give to a journal to respond to my complaints, 60% of these papers had not been acted. They're still out there with their duplication. Nothing has happened, just crickets. About 28% of these papers have been corrected. And about 10% of these papers, after 5, 6 years, have been retracted. I think this should have been half. But, you know, it's nice that papers are corrected and retracted, but I think it's freaking bad that, given the amount of money that the scientific publishing business make, that 60% of these papers has not been acted upon. I've written to these journals under my full name, still with my Stanford affiliation, in the hope that it would give some credibility. But in most cases, journals didn't even respond. Or they said, we'll look into this, and then nothing happened. So, yeah, that's pretty bad. I tried to play it according to the rules, reporting it to the journal editors, keeping it quiet, not rocking any boats, but the journals didn't really respond. And so, just showing some bad editorial decisions here. Here we have a photo in which I have found, let's say, some problems. There are some duplicated elements here. This is a transmission electron microscopy photo. I've never done TEM, but I think something is really bad going on with this photo. And so I wrote to the journal, and the journal allowed a correction. They allowed the researcher to send in a new photo that had no problems, or was just a better Photoshop, I don't know. And yeah, it got corrected, problem solved. Well, the big problem here is that the author is actually an associate editor of that journal. And so you can sort of see that the conflict of interest that might play a role here. The main editor, the editor-in-chief, might not have, you know, might have been best buddies with the associate editor, at least they know each other. And yeah, they didn't seem to want to really slap this person too hard on the hand. They just gave him the chance to correct this image. And I think this should have been a retraction. If you would follow COPE guidelines, this is a manipulated photo. I think this should be 100% retraction. There's no doubt about it. So this is what I call the bad editorial decision. And I'll be happy to post this online on Twitter and start a discussion. Here we have another bad editorial decision. This is what I would call the naive editor. If you look at these images, you see lots of parts that appear to have been cloned. Again, a type 3 duplication. And yeah, I sent this in. And the authors then sent in another set of photos, and they said, oh, yeah, there were some incorrect blots sent. Well, yeah, incorrect, but it's, in my opinion, this appears to have been photoshopped. So here, the editor just was very gullible and just accepted the new set of photos. And this paper was also corrected, where it should have been retracted. So lots of these examples. I have about 4,000 papers that I've reported now, so I could show you many more. But the point is that I tried to play it in the official, professional way. I contacted the editor-in-chief. I contacted the research integrity officer of the university. They might have started an investigation or not. But the fact is that the majority of these cases are not acted upon. And I think 1 year should be a reasonable amount. I've waited even 5 or 6 years. So I gave everybody a chance to respond, but nothing happens. So I'm now doing it the sort of frustrated and proactive way. I'm posting on Papier because I don't really care that much about what happens to these papers or the authors. But I want to warn the people who might use these papers, who might base their research on these papers. I feel they need to be warned. We need to have a quick method of telling people that there might be a big problem with this paper. And so I'm posting on papier.com and I'm posting on social media. And some people might call that trial by Twitter, in which I try to maybe insinuate that people did misconduct. And of course, I have a lot of thoughts, and I've shared some of them with you today there about those cases. But in many cases, I try to post on Twitter just showing the problem, and then not saying this is misconduct. But of course, people will then draw their own conclusions. And sometimes it helps to discuss these things on social media. We know about, for example, the Me Too movement, about sexual harassment cases, which are obviously of a very different proportion than scientific misconduct. But sometimes it helps to bring these cases out in the open and discuss them online. And it might force journals or institutions to act. But my main purpose is to warn other readers. And so I've been a power user of Papier, and I can recommend the plugin. And I've shown you also here on the right side of the slide, you see this example of what you, if you do a particular literature search, you might see these green little banners showing that these papers have a Papier comment, and you can click on them and see what people had to say about these papers. And so, obviously, the work that I'm doing is ruffling some feathers. I'm making lots of enemies because I'm criticizing other people's work. And not only do I do that, there's other people doing that as well. So here are 3 examples in which I have not been involved. I haven't really been involved in these cases, of 3 researchers who have been criticized on Papier or somewhere else, and who, instead of answering the comments on Papier, they decided to threaten with legal actions. So some people discussed some papers about social spiders, and there were big problems in these papers that were found. But instead of these papers being swiftly retracted, they're still under investigation because the main researcher who has been accused of misconduct is threatening with legal action. Or there have been cases where there were many comments on Papier, and that the researcher wanted to sue Papier, but that luckily didn't happen, but there were definitely threats. There have been articles for example, in the New York Times, in which the facts were presented, but still the researcher tried to sue the New York Times for publishing a paper about his potential misconduct. So these legal threats can be quite scary, and they can be quite intimidating. And I don't think they're really meant to win the case. They're meant to silence the people who criticize these people's work. And so I've been involved in a case myself. There was a famous paper. We just heard that President Trump tweeted about this paper. I think the only time he tweeted about a scientific paper at all. And it was this paper. And the paper claimed that hydroxychloroquine was the treatment of choice for COVID-19 cases. It was based on a very small patient set, and it had lots and lots of problems. I wrote a long critique about it on Papier. I wrote a blog post about it. I found lots and lots of problems in it. You know, I wasn't against hydroxychloroquine. I just didn't think that there was enough evidence in this paper to switch completely to hydroxychloroquine as the method of treatment of choice. So a couple of weeks or so after this paper was discussed, not just by me, but others as well, an expression of concern was put on the paper, but then it disappeared again. And it's still a bit unclear. Like, this paper is still, it's not retracted, even though there have been many other papers showing that this paper could not possibly have been true. And why did this expression of concern disappear? So there was actually a journalism report where they showed that the editor or the publisher had received a threatening letter by the senior author in which he threatened with legal action if this expression of concern did not quickly disappear, and so it did. And so it seems that the editor or the publisher decided to not pursue this expression of concern or investigation because one of the authors threatened to sue him. And so this is very intimidating if you get a letter like that. And I can comment on that myself. I've received also a letter like that. So this professor from the hydroxychloroquine is threatening to sue me. There was also another case in which I received a very intimidating legal letter from a completely different author, in which they asked me to remove blog posts, to remove tweets, to remove PubPeer posts. And I wrote them back saying, I'm not going to do that. And then they wrote me back saying, well, that's not very wise. But then it stopped. So I hope it's just a threat. But I'm not being really sure about that. And it does keep me up at night because, I don't know, I'm just an independent person. I don't have Stanford University backing me up with powerful lawyers or the New York Times, who has a whole legal team. I'm just me. And this could financially ruin me. But I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to fight that fight. And luckily, I'm supported by a lot of people in the scientific community who think the same way, who think that scientific discussions do not belong in the courtroom, but belong amongst scientists themselves. That all these issues that we raise on PubPeer could be answered. All these concerns could be taken away by the authors themselves, because maybe they have a very convincing explanation for some of the problems that we're finding. Maybe some of the problems, for example, with permits or IRB approvals that were not mentioned in the paper. Maybe they were really there. Maybe they just got mentioned in the paper, but maybe the author could convince me that really the research had been done under the appropriate approval. So I think in many cases I can raise concerns, but the author could also reply and take away these concerns. When they don't, when they choose to not reply, but choose to sue me, I think I've actually asked the right questions. And so this strengthens me to keep on asking these questions. But again, I'm very supported by this outpour of the scientific community. And I'm very proud that on the same day I appeared both in Science as well in Nature. I don't think I would have ever been able to do that with my regular research. And it's just fantastic to know how much support I've gotten for these cases. So I still have some time left. So I've talked a lot about duplicated images. Most of these cases are, I believe, from sort of individuals who cheat, who want to cheat for whatever reason. But there's also organized crime in scientific publishing, and those are paper mills. And paper mills are companies that sell scientific papers that are completely fake to authors who need them. And this is a particular problem in China, not because people in China are more or less fraudulent than people in other countries, but because there's a specific incentive, a specific requirement in China for medical doctors who are very early career, who have finished medical school, and who want to work in a hospital. They have the requirement to publish a scientific paper. Now, in the US, you can choose, if you do a medical school, you can choose to have a completely clinical path or to choose a research career or something of a hybrid, but you're given time off to do research. We all know we cannot just do research in our free time unless you're crazy enough like me to scan papers in your free time. Most people don't have the time to do an additional research project on top of their regular work. And especially if you're a medical doctor and you do an 80-hour clinical shift every week, you don't have the time to do research. You might not even work in a hospital that has research facilities. And so how do you fulfill this impossible requirement? You buy a paper because it's an investment for your career. Once you have your paper, once you can check that box, you can forget about research. You might not care about research at all. You just want to focus on patient care. And so these medical doctors massively buy these papers that are completely fake. We think that they're fake. They look real, though. The papers themselves look surprisingly real. you would not really see the pattern. It's only when people like us who scan massive amounts of papers, we start to see patterns. And we found these papers that appear to all have been written on the same template. They all seem to be the same paper, but they have slightly different topics. And you wouldn't catch any plagiarism in there. There's not a single sentence. In most cases, there's not a single sentence that's the same. But yet, we discovered, for example, a group of papers that we now call the Tadpole paper mill. And I'm not sure if you can all read it, but their titles were surprisingly similar. If you sort of start to see a pattern, and it's almost like some random generator chooses from a set of words and generates a new title, but based on this very given structure. And similarly, the structure of the papers was also very similar. But most importantly, so here are two examples of papers. This is a different paper mill. We call this the stock photo paper mill. This is a group of 125 papers that I've worked on. And in these papers, at first glance, these papers look not that similar to each other. They have different figures. They're both retracted now. But if you look very carefully and have some memory for photos, you might see these two images that I've marked here with a red box. It doesn't really appear here very well. These photos are actually the same. But these are two different papers, two different sets of authors, but they use the same photo. How can two sets of very different authors that are not related to each other use the same photo? Well, because they bought this paper from the same paper mill. So if you look at these photos in more detail, you can see they're from two different papers. They're supposed to represent very different experiments. And yet, these photos are the same. They're zoomed in differently. They're upside down with respect to each other. But if you see this little area that are marked with the letter J, you might spot that these photos are exactly the same. And so they were sold to two different groups of authors. There's actually 125 papers that all pulled from the same set of papers, same set of photos. And then there's other paper mills that we found. Here's what I call the comb paper mill. And these have correlation plots that all look very, very similar to each other. You might spot that all these four plots, they come from 4 different papers, 4 completely different sets of authors, no overlap, 4 different hospitals, 4 different provinces in China. But the graphs are remarkably the same. They all have very similar dots. Some dots were removed, some dots were added, but it's all based on the same template. And so you cannot really see this if you look at these as an individual paper. You might not spot that. Excuse me. But if you compare all of these and start to see the patterns, these papers all look very similar to each other. And then here's one that is also from a paper mill. And not sure if you can read it, but this is an example of why we think that this paper comes from a paper mill and that they're all written on the same template. So we actually found this set of papers because they all used a very similar text as the legend of Table 1. And this particular paper talked about prostate cancer patients. And I don't know if you've spotted that about half of the prostate cancer patients were female. And I don't think this paper was really peer-reviewed. And once I point this out to you, you might never look at a paper again the same way. But there were many papers in this paper mill. Some were prostate cancer. You expect a certain gender ratio there. But some were colon cancer, or breast cancer, or liver cancer, or colon cancer. And they all had this same table, but all the numbers are different. You would not be able to find this by just scanning for the numbers, but they all had a very similar text in the table. The legends were all very similar, which is how we were able to find them. And of course, by pointing out these things on papier, I'm also telling the paper mills how to not do it the next time. So they'll be better. They'll be scanning for these things, and I believe by now we won't be able to recognize paper mill papers again. I think at this point we've reached a point where we can no longer know if a paper is real or not. Maybe only can confirm that by replicating the results. So I'm going to skip these, and I'm going to end my talk with a discussion. So this is a slide usually where I end with by asking some questions to think about it. So I've talked a little bit about why people do misconduct. And again, these are sad stories. I don't want to ridiculize people because I know there's often cases where there might be a bully as a professor, a bully as a PI, and there might be a graduate student who feels the only way out of that lab is by producing particular results. And if you have a professor who says, I'm going to fire you unless you have this paper ready by the end of the month, what are you going to do? In academia, we're so dependent, there's so much hierarchy, there's so much power of the PI that as a lower member, a junior researcher, you're often intimidated by that. And because I'm Dutch as well, I know I'm not very intimidated by bosses. But in most other countries, that is the case. The boss is the boss, and he or she can fire you. And if you're on a visa in the US and you're fired, that means you have to leave the US within 5 days. You have to pack up and leave the country. That is super intimidating, especially if you have your family and you have to go back to another country. You can sort of see that people might be desperate and might just think, I want to get out of this lab. I'm going to fake some results as long as I get my paper. So I do think we focus way too much on publications and productivity as a measure of productivity. Not sure how to change this system, but I sort of want to plug for more measures of reproducibility. And I wish there was a type of research job in which people could just reproduce other people's results. I think a lot of researchers would be totally happy with that as a career, especially people who love working in the lab, who don't want to manage other people, who don't want to think about getting grants, but just replicating other people's results. I think that's the only way we know if a paper was real or not, because if you think of how easy it is to generate fake videos with, I don't know, Tom Cruise on golf courses, and it's not really Tom Cruise, how easy would it be to make a fake Western blot? Very easy. And so we would not spot that. The only way, I think, of knowing if a paper is real is to replicate it. We've touched a little bit upon the many conflicts of interests that are within publishers and institutions to not investigate these cases. Unfortunately, I've had too many emails where clear cases of photoshopping were judged by the institution to be, something went wrong in that lab. We fired the postdoc, but the professor is still there and actually gets there another NIH grant the next year. And yeah, I feel we need to hold the people in power positions more accountable, and not just fire the poor postdoc who felt they needed to do this, but to also focus on the atmosphere in every lab. Whose role is it to detect science misconduct? So I'm mostly an unpaid volunteer, sponsored by Patreon, but I'm not getting paid for this by a salary. I do feel there should be more effort within the publishers, who we pay hundreds of millions of dollars to get our papers published. We write our papers for free, we peer review them for free, we might even edit them for free, and yet we have to pay $4,000 to get a paper published. Where does that money go to? I'm not always sure about the answer of that, but I feel there should be some effort. If you sell a product that is so expensive, you need to have some quality control, and you need to be held accountable. If I buy a car and the wheel falls off a year later, I feel I have some rights as a customer. And so if we find an error in a scientific paper, there should be some recall mechanism where the publisher should be held accountable for the quality. I also hope there's better legal protection for whistleblowers like me, or just in general for scientists who raise concerns about pandemics or origin of viruses. How can we better be protected from the influence of social media, the harassment of people online, or even the threats to our family? There should be better measures taken for that, because most scientists want to tell the truth, and we fight for that, and we should not be punished for that. And in the end, I think the most important thing to remember is not only does science misconduct have a tremendous cost for science in general, because we might base our research on results that didn't happen, but also for the scientific community in general at all, because there's already so much misinformation. There's already so much distrust by the general audience in science papers that all these bad papers that are getting out there and published that then later get retracted or discussed, that even ruins the trust of the audience in science even more. And I think as a scientific community, we need to be better guardians of the quality in science and to act faster if we find a faulty product. So with that, thank you for your attention. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm Microbiome Digest. You can play the game Image Forensics. I make it about a game there, not about the paper. And you can win an emoji award if you are the first person to find the duplication. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for this fascinating and also sobering lecture. I learned a few more new things, and they were not all nice, I should say. And specifically, I find it so disappointing, like you say, that these journals respond so badly. You would imagine that the only thing they really sell is quality control. And it's amazing that they don't have their acts together. So I'm really puzzled. I'm really puzzled. And they do have problems in that industry with getting that act together, amazingly. Might it be, what are your thoughts on that? That they're so feared for lawsuits that that's the reason they respond not or so slow?
That might be one of the concerns. I also think that most bigger publishers have grown into this waterhead of managers, and I don't even know, like shiny buildings that do, I'm not quite sure what, you know, lots of people who do wonderful things, I'm sure, who talk about policies, but not actually, you know, people on the floor who address these problems. PLOS One, for example, I've been to PLOS, that has a beautiful shiny office, very expensive in San Francisco. And it was the first time I was at the publisher. I'm like, what are all these people doing here? Because I'm peer reviewing these papers. And then, you know, it's like some automated system. And then like what are all these folks doing? I don't know. But, you know, we pay them money, but that doesn't need to cost that many, or shouldn't have that many people. And yet, yeah, there's this shiny building full of people who do something, but all these papers that I put on their lap, they didn't have time. They said, oh, we don't have staff to look at these things and to contact the authors. I'm like, well, what do you do then the whole day? They actually hired 2 people to deal with the 400 papers that I dumped on their lap. So they do now about 1 paper a week of the 400 that I sent them. So it will take them, I don't know, 20 more years or so to handle all these cases. And I've been sending them new ones as well. So I have a very pessimistic view maybe on scientific publishing, and maybe I'm, you know, stepping on some toes here, but I do feel we need to go to a new model, and we need to have, we need to maybe send less money to these publishers and think about new ways of publishing results that could also count towards our careers and our resumes. Maybe publish just 1 figure. That's one of the things I'm thinking of, where you publish 1 figure, I get points for that, other people replicate this, they also get points for that, and then we have all together proven that this is a scientific experiment worth building our careers on. But I hope we can sort of abandon the very costly scientific publishing model, make it much more open and transparent.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. There's a question there. Please go ahead.
Bas van Steensel, Netherlands Cancer Institute. The few times that I've contacted journals or an institute about an allegation, a problem, I found it took me so much time to do it right. But you have to write the perfect letter, you have to collect all the evidence, triple check everything. How do you do this? Because it's so time consuming. Is there a trick, a tip that you have how to limit? Because it's unfair, right? Somebody else made a mistake, and then you as a whistleblower have to put in so much effort. Right. So what is the trick here to deal with that?
I wish all the journals would subscribe to Papier and you know, spend a tiny bit of money and have an automatic email sent to them, like, some of your papers have been commented on, here are the problems, done with it. It's so much work, like you said, for me to write to, you know, I've by now 4,000 or 5,000 papers that I found. And most of them I haven't even reported. The 600, the 800 I did, but later on I sort of posted online, it's too much work to even find the email addresses of the editors, because they're very hidden on most journals. If I want to contact a research integrity officer, that can sometimes take hours to find, to hunt down, because they have a lot of beautiful policies online, but no person to contact to. Or I cannot contact the university because I don't have the university email address, so I don't have access to their sites. It's only made for internal whistleblowers. And so I actually have a database with, that we worked on with several whistleblowers with all the email addresses that we could find. But even that, it's hard to keep track, especially when I send an email to 20, let's say I have a set of 23 papers, which were published in 20 different journals. Every journal has maybe a journal email address and an editor-in-chief and 3 other editors-in-chief. It takes me like 4 or 5 hours to gather all that information, to send all the Papier links to them. And then some might respond, some might not respond. I cannot keep track of that. That would be a full-time administrative job, and I don't have time. So my administration is not very good. And I'm sort of more and more abandoning the idea of even sending this to the publishers.
Yeah. There are many questions online, and I take 2 simple ones for a start. How do you select the papers, the journals you're going to scan?
I work off many leads, so I feel like I'm a detective. I get anonymous tips. I get emails, LinkedIn, tweets, direct messages. And I work from the leads that I still have based on that initial set of 800, because some of these papers, I want to check out other papers by the same authors. Or I read about a case online, I'm like, oh, let's check that. So yeah, many different ways that I get information.
Yeah, multiple angles. Yeah. So we can send a tweet to you and then you might respond.
I might respond. I get more every day than I can handle. And yeah, it's too much. It's too much.
The other simple question is, or maybe not so simple, I'm not sure. You do commissioned work as well. And when you find something ugly, do you post that on Papier as well?
No, I cannot do that, because that's the work I do as a contractor. That's, I guess I have to keep that confidential. Yeah. So usually I have to sign something that I cannot
Agreement
post
of confidentiality.
Yes, yes. There might be some cases in which actually a person might want to publish it and might ask me to post it on Twitter or Papier, but all the cases I've worked on under such contract, I do privately. So I just send them a report back, and it might actually be in favor of the person, might be as a defense for that person.
Sure, yeah. That's an option as well, of course. All right. Another question from the room. Zico.
You just called yourself a detective. I actually think you're more of a Dark Knight. You're not the Dark Knight we deserve, but the one we need. You're basically Batman. And Batman does his job as a vigilante because nobody else is doing it. And that's why I wanted to follow up on one of your suggestions just now on doing more replication studies. And one idea I've heard a couple of times over the past years is that wouldn't it be a great idea for every PhD course or trajectory to include at least one replication study?
Yes.
Because then we can all become Batman. What do you think about that suggestion?
Well, I don't see myself really as Batman, because I feel I just do work that anybody could do. And I don't have any superpowers. But yeah, I think that's a wonderful suggestion. And I think, how cool is it to replicate somebody else's results? You'll learn a lot. You'll learn how to read a paper. You'll learn how to hold a pipette and how to read between the lines and how to know what things were actually not mentioned in the methods, which are many things. We all know that if you work with RNA, it can be, if you shake something for 200 RPM, is that like an orbital shaker? Is it back and forth? That could make a big difference, and that is often not mentioned in the methods. And so I think it's a wonderful way to learn how to not write a paper and how to write it in a paper how to write it in a way that is replicable for other people as well. And I think a lot of people would love that as a first check, especially when you're in your first uncertain years and you have no idea how to do an experiment. Just replicate somebody else's results and get credit for that.
Yeah. Well, one more question from the room, please.
First of all, thank you very much for doing this really important and rather thankless job. And I was wondering, you said there was a correlation between impact factor and the amount of doctored images. And was there also a correlation between the impact factor and how they would reply to your you pointing that out?
Well, no. I think it's very dependent on the journal. I've actually had very bad experiences with Science and Nature. And it's very heavily dependent on the case, so which makes me suspect that in some cases there are huge conflicts of interest. When a young researcher, a postdoc or a graduate student can be thrown under the bus, that will happen and the paper might get retracted. Or when maybe it's a not native or English-speaking person, they get thrown under the bus also. So there's also potential racism there. It's very dependent on the case, and I am planning to write a paper, but I never have time because I get so many requests for new cases, to see what happened to these 800 papers and correlate that to impact factor, open access journal, other editors. I'm not quite sure what, but like I think there's many conclusions to be drawn from that. But from my first impression, it's very dependent and it seems to be very random what happens to a paper.
Yeah, we even get anonymous questions online, which is good, and Papier is well inspiring. This maybe even, and this is an interesting question maybe as well, and that is, you said, I'm focusing on the work, on the integrity of the work, and not on the person. But at the same time, you mentioned several times that you wouldn't trust anything from this lab when something bad occurred in one paper of that lab. Is that consistent with each other?
Yeah, that sounds maybe contradictory. What I was trying to say is that online I try not to ridiculize people. I do think you can draw your own conclusions when you search for a particular name and you see that that particular author had 40 Papier comments. I think you should be able to draw on your own conclusion, especially if you see that the older papers, that person was first author and then sort of moved, and that all the papers with that name as last author also has problems. I do think I have opinions, obviously, about people, but I try not to really mention that too much online because I know also that that could break a person's career, and I'm not always 100% certain who was the culprit. Like usually papers have many authors, and if you just look at one paper, I wouldn't trust anything from that paper if there was a Photoshop. I just think that one Photoshopped image should be enough to retract the whole paper and to put serious concerns with other papers from that lab. But it's hard to know which particular person that is from. So I think it's more on a lab level than on a personal level where you can draw these conclusions, although there are exceptions to that.
Yeah, sure. That's clarifying. Yuri, the microphone, please, because people online need to listen to it as well.
Well, thank you so much for this beautiful talk and the beautiful, outrageous work that you're doing. It's beautiful to see how much effort you put in this. I had two questions. The follow-up question is, maybe I misunderstood this, but I think you're not contacting the corresponding author, right? And I was wondering, why are you not contacting them? Because if I was running a lab and I was the corresponding author and the first or the second author did this, I would really want to know first to have a discussion with the author and retract it myself. So I would feel so much more inclined to do that. So that's my first question. Yeah.
So the answer is that in most cases that's not very productive. I do indirectly contact the authors through Papier, because when you post a problem about a paper and you make sure that the email of that author is added to the Papier, they will get a comment, they will get a message that there's a comment on your paper and you can reply on that. I think there, because it's online, it's public, the authors usually don't say something bad. If I would directly contact an author, I'm in some cases where things went wrong and the editor actually forwarded my whole email, including my email address, to the author. That was in the beginning. The author was very angry with me, and I didn't feel that was very productive, because they can send me angry emails back because it's not in the public eye, so they will be less inhibited to say something bad about me.
So I would send a grateful email back to say.
I have received very few thankful emails on Papier.
Yeah, okay.
And the thing is that most of these things are not honest errors. I do believe most of this is misconduct or very sloppy.
Yeah.
And when I see comments on Papier, very often, don't have any numbers, they're negative. They're, you know, trying to drag my whole past, all my papers, or anything they can find about me personally. So they counterattack. And it's very rare that I've seen responses where the senior author says, wait, this is serious? There are a couple of exceptions, I've seen that. But and I just know by the reply of the author if they were involved in a misconduct or not. Because if they say, what you're saying, I'm going to look into this, that's very serious, I do believe they had no idea. And but if they say, you're a bad woman, then, and they sort of clap back to me, I feel I've hit them where it hurts.
Yeah, I understand. Can I ask another question?
Yeah, short one.
Well, it's about passion. So what makes you continue this work? I mean, all these nasty emails, all these nasty tweets, the threats, the everything, and the hard work. I mean, it costs so much time. So what? And of course, the quest for honesty is an important supporting fact, motivating factor, maybe. But why are you continuing this work?
I think, and this sounds, of course, very arrogant, but I believe I'm right. I ask the right questions. I have the right to raise these concerns. And I feel empowered by the more trolls that hit me. I mean, of course, that keeps me up at night. And of course, I am worried about it, and I lose sleep over it, and other bad things. But I feel if that happens, I did ask the right questions, and I have asked questions that nobody else dared to ask them. And yeah, there's a feeling of, I think also because I'm backed up by so many people, I feel very empowered to do that. But also because I'm not employed, I don't have any legal team behind me, but I also don't have a boss who tells me, Elise, you should not rock the boat too much, which has happened in the past. I'm a very difficult to employ person. You do not want to hire me because we'll end up with an argument. But I think in this position, that gives me a lot of power to ask the right questions. I don't have any, conflicts or inhibitions from above. And I just feel I'm doing the right thing. But sometimes I have to dig deep, yes.
Wow, this is an excellent way to end this meeting. Time is up, which is a pity. There are more questions. I'm sorry for that. I'd like to thank you all for this really interesting meeting, specifically the two speakers, of course, also the audience, all the active participation, all the people online. I'm sorry I couldn't bring up all your questions, of course. For those of you who are here in the room, we offer a drink outside, alcoholic or non-alcoholic, whatever you like. The people at home, I'm sorry, you have to cater for yourself this time, like we used to in Corona times. I'd like to thank Pakhuis de Zwijger for organizing this from the technical angle pretty well and pretty good. It was excellent, in fact. And also Doreen van der Schot of the Netherlands Research Integrity Network, who organized everything. And when it goes so smoothly, that means that it has been a lot of work. So a round of applause for the people in the back.